Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and we are back with more in the Buddha's words. So yeah, we are hoping to finish this general introduction in today's episode, which hopefully we should. It's not too awfully long. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump into this. The Pali Canon. Sadly, the canonical collections belonging to most of the early mainstream Indian Buddhist schools were lost when Indian Buddhism was devastated by the Muslims that invaded northern India in the 11th and 12th centuries. These invasions effectively sounded the death knell for Buddhism in the land of its birth. Only one complete collection of texts belonging to one of the early Indian Buddhist schools managed to survive intact. This is the collection preserved in the language that we know as Pali. This collection belonged to the ancient Theravada school, which had been transplanted to Sri Lanka in the 3rd century BCE, and thus managed to escape the havoc wrought upon Buddhism in the motherland. About the same time, the Theravada also spread to Southeast Asia and in later centuries became dominant throughout the region. The Pali Canon is the collection of texts the Theravada regards as the word of the Buddha. Buddhavacana. The fact that the texts of this collection have survived as a single canon does not mean that they can all be dated back from the same period, nor does it mean that the texts forming the most archaic nucleus are necessarily more ancient than their counterparts from the other Buddhist schools, many of which have survived in Chinese or Tibetan translations as part of the entire canons, or in a few cases as isolated texts in another Indian language. Nevertheless, the Pali Canon has a special importance for us all, and that is so for at least 3 reasons. First, it is a complete collection all belonging to a single school. Even though we can detect clear signs of historical development between portions of the canon, this alignment with a single school gives the text a certain degree of uniformity. Among the texts stemming from the same period, we can even speak of a homogeneity of contents, a single flavor underlying the manifold expressions of the doctrine. The homogeneity is most evident in the 4 Nikayas and the older parts of the 5th Nikaya, and gives us reason to believe that with these texts allowing for the qualification expressed above, that they have counterparts in other extinct Buddhist schools. We have reached the most ancient stratum of Buddhist literature discoverable. Second, the entire collection has been preserved in a Middle Indo-Aryan language, one closely related to the language, far more likely the various regional dialects that the Buddha himself spoke. We call this language Pali, but the name for the language actually arose through a misunderstanding. The word Pali properly means text, that is, the canonical text as distinct from the commentaries. The commentators refer to the language in which the texts are preserved as Pali Bhasa, the language of the text. At some point, the term was misunderstood to mean the Pali language, and once the misconception rose, it took root and has been with us ever since. Scholars regard this language as a hybrid showing features of several Prakrit dialects used around the 3rd century BCE, subjected to a partial process of Sanskritization. While the language is not identical with any of the Buddha himself would have spoken, it belongs to the same broad linguistic family as those he might have used and originates from the same conceptual matrix. This language thus reflects the thought world that the Buddha inherited from the wider Indian culture into which he was born, so that its words capture the subtle nuances of that thought world without the intrusion of alien influences inevitable in even the best and most scrupulous translations. This contrasts with Chinese, Tibetan, and English translations of the texts, which reverberate with the connotations of the words chosen from the target languages. The third reason is the Pali Canon has special importance is that this collection is authoritative for the contemporary Buddhist school. Unlike the textual collections of the extinct schools of early Buddhism, which are purely of academic interest, this collection still brims with life. It inspires the faith of millions of Buddhists from the villages and monasteries of Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and Southeast Asia to the cities and meditation centers of Europe and the Americas. It shapes their understanding, guides them in the face of difficult ethical choices, informs their meditative practices, and offers them the keys to liberating insight. The Pali Canon is commonly known as the Tipitaka, the 3 baskets or 3 compilations. This threefold classification was not unique to the Theravada school, but was in common use among the Indian Buddhist schools as a way to categorize the Buddhist canonical texts. Even today, the scriptures preserved in Chinese translation are known as the Chinese Tripitaka. The 3 compilations of the Pali Canon are 1. The Vinaya Pitaka, the compilation of discipline, which contains the rules laid down for the guidance of the monks and nuns and the regulations prescribed to the harmonious functioning of the monastic order. 2. The Sutta Pitaka, the compilation of discourses, which contains the suttas, the discourses of the Buddha and those of his chief disciples, as well as inspirational works in verse narratives, and certain works of a commentarial nature. 3. The Abhidhamma Pitaka, the compilation of philosophy, a collection of 7 treatises which subject the Buddha's teachings to rigorous philosophical systemization. The Abhidhamma Pitaka is obviously the product of a later phase in the evolution of Buddhist thought than the other 2 Pitakas. The Pali version represents the Theravada schools attempt to systemize the older teachings. Other early schools apparently had their own Abhidhamma systems. The Sarvastivada system is the only one whose canonical texts have survived intact in their entirety. Its canonical collection, like the Pali version, also consists of 7 texts. These were originally composed of Sanskrit, but are preserved in full only in Chinese translation. The system they define differs significantly from that of the Theravada counterpart in both formulation and philosophy. The Sutta Pitaka, which contains the records of the Buddha's discourses and discussions, consists of 5 collections called Nikayas. In the age of the commentators, they were also known as the Agamas, like their counterparts in northern Buddhism. The 4 major Nikayas are 1. The Digha Nikaya, a collection of long discourses, 34 suttas, arranged into 3 vagas, or books. 2. The Majjhima Nikaya, the collection of middle-length discourses, 152 suttas, arranged into 3 vagas. 3. The Samyutta Nikaya, the collection of connected discourses, close to 3,000 short suttas grouped into 56 chapters called Samyuttas, which are in turn collected into 5 vagas. 4. The Anguttara Nikaya, the collection of numerical discourses, or perhaps incremental discourses, approximately 2,400 short suttas arranged into 11 chapters, called Nipatas. The Digha Nikaya and Majjhima Nikaya at first glance seem to be the established principally on the basis of length. The longer discourses go into the Digha, the middle-length discourses into the Majjhima. Careful tabulations of their context, however, suggest that another factor might underlie the distinction between these 2 collections. The suttas of the Digha Nikaya are largely aimed at a popular audience and seem intended to attract potential converts to the teaching by demonstrating the superiority of the Buddha and his doctrine. The suttas of the Majjhima Nikaya are largely directed inward toward the Buddhist community and have been designed to acquaint newly ordained monks with the doctrines and practices of Buddhism. It remains an open question whether these pragmatic purposes are the determining criteria behind the 2 Nikayas, or whether the primary criterion is length, with these pragmatic purposes following as incidental consequences of their respective differences in length. The Samyutta Nikaya is organized by way of subject matter. Each subject is the yoke, samyoga, that connects the discourses into a samyutta or chapter. Hence, the title of the collection, the Connected Samyutta Discourses. The first book, the book with verses, is unique to being compiled on the basis of literary genre. It contains suttas in mixed prose and verse arranged in 11 chapters by way of subject. The other 4 books each contain long chapters dealing with the principal doctrines of early Buddhism. Books 2, 3, and 4 each open with a long chapter devoted to a theme of major importance, respectively dependent origination. Chapter 12, Nidana Samyutta, the 5 aggregates. Chapter 22, Khandasamyutta, and the 6 internal and external sense bases. Chapter 35, Salayatana Samyutta. Part 5 deals with the principal groups of training factors that in the post-canonical period came to be called the 37 aids to enlightenment. Bodhipakkhya Dhamma. These include the Noble Eightfold Path, Chapter 45, Maggasamyutta, the 7 Factors of Enlightenment, Chapter 46, Bojjhanga Samyutta, and the 4 Establishments of Mindfulness, Chapter 47, Satipatthana Samyutta. From its contents, we might infer that the Samyutta Nikaya was intended to serve the needs of 2 groups within the monastic order. One consisted of the doctrinal specialists, those monks and nuns who sought to explore the deep implications of the Dhamma and to elucidate them for their companions in the religious life. The other consisted of those devoted to the meditative development of insight. The Anguttara Nikaya is arranged according to the numerical scheme derived from peculiar feature of the Buddha's pedagogic method. To facilitate easy comprehension and memorization, the Buddha often formulated his discourses by way of numerical sets, a format that helped to ensure that the ideas he conveyed would be easily retained in mind. The Anguttara Nikaya assembles these numerical discourses into a single massive work of 11 nipatas, or chapters, which each representing the number of terms upon which the constituent suttas have been framed. Thus, there is the chapter of the ones, Ekakanipata, the chapter of the twos, Dukkhanipata, the chapter of the threes, Tikkanipata, and so forth, up and ending with the chapter of the 11s, Ekadasa Nipata. Since the various groups of path factors have been included in the Samyutta, the Anguttara can focus on those aspects of training that have not been incorporated in the repetitive sets. The Anguttara includes a notable proportion of suttas addressed to lay followers dealing with the ethical and spiritual concerns of life within the world, including family relationships, husbands and wives, children and parents, and the proper ways to acquire, save, and utilize wealth. Other arrangement of this collection makes it particularly convenient for formal instruction, and thus it could easily be drawn upon by elder monks when teaching their pupils and by preachers when giving sermons to the laity. Besides the four major Nikayas, the Pali Sutta Pitaka includes a fifth Nikaya called the Khuddaka Nikaya. This name means the minor collection. Perhaps it originally consisted merely of a number of minor works that could not be included in the four major Nikayas. But as more and more works were composed over the centuries and added to it, its dimensions swelled until it became the most voluminous of the five Nikayas. At the heart of the Khuddaka, however, is a small constellation of short works composed either entirely in verse, namely the Dhammapada, the Therigatha, and the Therigatha, or in mixed prose and verse, the Sutta Nipata, the Udana, and the Ituvataka. Though whose style and contents suggest that they are of great antiquity. Other texts of the Khuddaka Nikaya, such as the Padasambhidhamagga and the two Nidesas, represent the standpoint of the Theravada school, and thus must have been composed during the period of sectarian Buddhism, when the early schools had taken their separate paths of doctrinal development. The four Nikayas, as of the Pali Canon, have counterparts in the Agamas of the Chinese Tripitaka, though these are from different early schools. Corresponding to each respectively, there is a Dirghagama, probably stemming from the Dharmaguptaka school, originally translated from a Prakrit, a Madhyamagama school, and Samyuttaka-gama, both stemming from the Sarvastivada school and translated from Sanskrit, and an Ekottara-gama corresponding to the Anguttara Nikaya, generally thought to have belonged to a branch of the Mahasangika school, and to have been translated from a dialect of Middle Indo-Aryan or a mixed dialect of Prakrit with Sanskrit elements. The Chinese Tripitaka also contains translations of individual sutras from the four collections, perhaps from still other unidentified schools, and translations of individual books from the minor collection, including two translations of a Dhammapada, one said to be very close to the Pali version, and parts of the Sutta Nipata, which as a unified work does not exist in Chinese translation. A note on style. Readers of the Pali Suttas are often annoyed by the repetitiveness of the texts. It is difficult to tell how much of this stems from the Buddha himself, who, as an itinerant preacher, must have used the repetition to reinforce his points, and how much is due to the compilers. It is obvious, however, that a high proportion of the repetitiveness derives from the process of oral transmission. To avoid excessive repetitiveness in the translation, I have had to make ample use of elisions. In this respect, I follow the printed editions of the Pali texts, which are also highly abridged, but a translation intended for a contemporary reader requires still more compression if it is to avoid risking the reader's wrath. On the other hand, I have been keen to see that nothing essential to the original text, including the flavor, has been lost due to the abridgment. The ideals of the considerateness to the reader and the fidelity of the text sometimes make contrary demands on a translator. The treatment of repetition patterns in which the same utterance is made regarding a set of items is a perpetual problem in translating Pali Suttas. When translating a sutta about the 5 aggregates, for example, one is tempted to forgo the enumeration of the individual aggregates and instead turn the sutta into a general statement about the aggregates as a class. To my mind, such an approach risks turning translations into paraphrase and thereby losing too much of the original. My general policy has been to translate the full utterance in relation to the first and last members of the set and merely to enumerate the intermediate members separated by ellipsis points. Thus, in a sutta about the 5 aggregates, I render the statement in full only for form and consciousness, and in between have feeling, perception, volitional formations, implying thereby that the full statement likewise applies to them. This approach has required the frequent use of ellipsis points, a practice that also invites criticism. When faced with repetitive passages in narrative framework, I have sometimes condensed them rather than use the ellipsis points to show where text is being elided. However, with texts of doctrinal exposition, I adhere to the practice described and the preceding paragraph. I think the translator has the responsibility, when translating passages of doctrinal significance, to show exactly where text is being elided, and for this ellipsis points remain the best tool at hand. But yeah, that will go ahead and end the general introduction, which will take us into chapter 1, although chapter 1 or part 1 starts with an introduction. But 3, 4, 5, 6, a little over 6 pages, so it shouldn't take but one episode to cut through it. And then we get into the actual text. So yeah. Woo! The author tells us more about the different schools and the way the languages have kind of varied. The fact that not all the suttas are together, which makes compiling it something of a difficulty. But they have tried to be compiled in numerous of the Nikayas, the long discourses, the intermediate discourses, the connected discourses. I can't remember what the fourth one was already. I forgot, but yeah. But clearly even though there's a lot of text written, finding a more congruent and connective point between all the different texts is difficult. But yeah. And we see that even though the Buddha himself starts in India and where many of his disciples are, eventually the idea of his teachings and religion are forced to leave from India following Muslim immigration. I don't want to say invasion necessarily, but yeah, it kind of displaces the Buddhist teachings and religion. So yeah. Though I think Hinduism is still there and is the biggest religion in India, if I remember right. But yeah. So this is what we're going to be looking forward to. But next episode, we start into the first chapter with the introduction of the chapter. Now that we've finished the general introductions and the little forewords and all that, so. But yeah, as always, educate thyself, think, read, study, learn. Someone tells you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, later.